Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Sherwan Ali. I am a Middle East Research Manager at ACLID, and we are a conflict monitor and the leading source of data and analysis on global conflict. I'll be moderating today's session where we'll be discussing ACLID's latest report, A Red Sea Hall of Mirrors, US and Houthi statements versus actions, as well as developments across the region. This report is the first to follow a new, more engaging format we are trying out right now that aims to bring ACLID data together with external data to shed light on less covered aspects of conflict. And joining me today is the author of this report, Dr. Luca Nebula. Luca is a senior analyst for Yemen and the Gulf at ACLID, where he produces and coordinates analysis and contributes to the oversight of regional data coverage. Luca is an expert in political Islam, religious repression, subnational power dynamics, and tribal conflict, with over 15 years of experience in nonprofits, academia, and the private sector. Welcome, Luca, and thank you very much for this really important piece and for taking the time to walk us through it today.
Thank you, Sherwan, for the introduction.
Lovely. And we also have Bina Ali Khan on the call. Bina is an analyst, researcher, and fellow at Century International, focusing on the Arabian Peninsula, Gulf energy dynamics, and political economy in the Middle East. She was also previously the Yemen researcher at International Crisis Group. Welcome, Bina. And Bina will be putting Luca's work into context by highlighting critical developments that have taken place over the past few months across the region, and of course, in relation to the Red Sea crisis. To give everybody a bit of rundown of the format for this call, after Vina and Luca's remarks, we'll also have time for your questions. So please feel free to put them in the chat throughout the event, and we'll do our best to answer them in the second half of the call. And now, before I give the floor to our panelists, I'd just like to set the stage a bit by recapping the Red Sea crisis. It's been nearly 20 months since the Houthis attacked and hijacked the Galaxy Leader cargo ship in the Red Sea, triggering a crisis that propelled the group's name beyond Yemen and given them a central place in the regional escalation since October 7th. The crisis expanded beyond the Red Sea since and brought the group in direct conflict with both the United States and Israel. And since that first maritime attack, the Houthis withstood multiple campaigns by the US against them, direct attacks by Israel for the first time, and a redesignation as FTO by the US government, along with many other developments. By the end of this webinar, we hope to have helped you all come out with a better understanding of the dynamics that underline this crisis. And with that, I'll pass it over to Dina to start it off.
Thank you very much. Yes, so we've witnessed a series of very tumultuous events in the Middle East in a very short time span. You know, we had a long pattern of Israeli strikes in Iran, US strikes in key Iranian nuclear facilities, and we saw Iran responded with an attack on Al Udeid base in Qatar, but, you know, strikes were intercepted by the Qataris. At that point, Iran could say that, you know, it had responded when the actual damage was, you know, very minimal, and, you know, the attack itself was very carefully calibrated. The US afterwards then pushed for ceasefire between Iran and Israel, and at that point, Israeli strikes had stopped altogether. The Iranians did fire a barrage of missiles at Israel, and Israel was forced by the US not to respond. And the ceasefire has been in effect since then. So it's been around a week, and the ceasefire has cooled. But the big question remained, you know, whether or not there will be a more negotiated ceasefire, whether it will be sustainable instead of just, you know, a deal to halt fire for the time being. You know, will there be an agreement that involves Iran's nuclear program and, you know, sanctions too? And at this moment, I would say a lot of conversations, especially within, you know, Western media, is very much focused on how effective US strikes were on Iran and whether any kind of deal between Iran and the US is at all possible. I think it's clear that despite the Fordo strikes, the US is opposed to any protracted wars in the Middle East. And we can also see that with the US-Houthi pact as well. And that is why Trump is very much committed to the ceasefire between Iran and Israel. I think Trump's rhetoric straight after the Fordo strikes, saying that the job had been done, really speaks to his desire to avoid any protracted war. And I think when it comes to the ceasefire, we can compare it to, the ceasefire that was attained between Israel and Hezbollah, under which Israel can pretty much violate Iranian airspace at will and target Iranian forces and material. So I would say that although there is a cessation of hostilities right now, I don't think this war is by any means over. When it comes to the Iranian side, it's true, it was very much weakened by the 12-day war, but the system is very much in place. There has, of course, been interruptions to communication and coordination, but as a military structure, the IRGC is very much built in a way to overstand these kind of shocks. Iran, the system itself has proved largely resilient. Threats and fantasies that Israeli strikes would ignite some kind of popular uprising that would overthrow the regime proved empty. And I think the possible scenario right now, even if Iran hasn't even thought about it already, is to go straight for a nuclear weapon. I think the 12-day war for Iran really brought memories of the Iran-Iraq war, where it pretty much was isolated. The Islamic Republic virtually stood alone, apart from offering kind words from Russia and China, there was minimal material assistance. And I think when this kind of narrative is when Iran's ruling system really thrives. But as I said, although the system itself has proven largely resilient, the war has exposed deep vulnerabilities within the Islamic Republic. They have evidently weak air defenses, extensive intelligence penetration. Israel was completely able to dominate the Iranian skies. And because of this, you can see quite publicly increasing conversations within Iranian hardliner and reformist camps about the need to revise its military strategy. And these conversations actually started to take place, in the past year, where we saw the axis of resistance take on horrific blows from Israel in the face of Israeli bombardment in the past few years. And I think, moving forward, Iran is less likely to fully rely on the axis of resistance. Its forward defense strategy has proven very weak. And I think moving forward, we'll see closer relations with more traditional allies such as Russia and China, and also kind of a shift in the Iranian military strategy to focus more on strengthening conversations around air defenses and also, security of nuclear infrastructure. But I would say right now, the post-war period for Iran is just as important as the war period itself. And domestically, you can see an increase of nationalist rhetoric. There has been some rallying around the flag, but also, the Islamic Republic has increased crackdowns, arrests, and executions. I think, after the assassination of Haniyeh in Iran, Iran knew it was deeply infiltrated by Israel. But to this extent, I think the Islamic Republic is still kind of coming to terms with that. Israeli missiles were assembled and deployed into the country. They killed a string of top generals and nuclear scientists in hours. And, Mossad very clearly has a wide network inside of Iran. And all of this to say is that the Islamic Republic's top priority right now is A, maintaining domestic stability and tackling those deep infiltration issues. Throughout the Iran-Israel conflict, there was a lot of speculation about whether or not the Islamic Republic will close the Strait of Hormuz. This is a threat that has been dangled by Iran since the Islamic Republic arrived. And I think Iran deliberately avoided escalating the Strait of Hormuz. I think they fear it would justify US intervention in more of a prominent way. It's also political suicide for its own economy. Iran exports majority of its oil from the Strait of Hormuz, and it also doesn't want to alienate key allies such as Oman and China, who also rely on the strategic waterway. I think in the same way, Iran was careful not to involve other axis of resistance actors, such as the Houthis. They didn't want to justify US intervention, and they did not want regional blowback. I think we can see from the latest conflict that Iran's escalation model is very much staged. First, they will hit US interests in Gulf countries, and second, they will go to the maritime domain. And even if it gets to that point, I still think it's very unlikely Iran will close the Strait of Hormuz. It really prioritizes good relationships with Gulf actors right now. But at the same time, if the ceasefire breakdowns and there's a return to hostilities, Iran really doesn't have many good options left. Moving forward, I would say the main risk of escalation lies mainly with Israel. If Iran resumes enrichment or talks with the US, I think there is still a possibility that Israel will strike again. Israel military aims have not gone away, and they're firstly to degrade Iran's military, and secondly to eliminate its nuclear program. Those aims still remain, and I think once Israel feels threatened again, there is a high possibility that the war will resume. And if and when it does, energy security remains vulnerable, especially if the war starts and Israel hits gas and energy infrastructure. Iran, in such scenario, will take the war to the waters.
Thank you, Vina, for all of this. All very good points, very interesting. It's true, we're living in these historic times, although what times are not historic in the Middle East. Yes, definitely, we have to see the effect of the recent Iran-Israel, if not to call it, if we can't call it war, then maybe this cross bombardment, to see its effect on the broader region in general, and these secondary war scenes in whether Syria, Iraq, or Yemen. But now that we have mentioned the Strait of Hormuz and one side of the Arabian Peninsula, I think we're ready to move on to the other side and discuss the Red Sea. So, Luca, while the Houthis were very public in their threats about attacking US ships in the Red Sea during the crisis between Israel and Iran, and attacking Israel itself throughout the 12 days of direct confrontation between Iran and Israel, the Houthis only claimed one attack against Israel, and in spite of vowing to attack US ships if the latter would target Iran directly, they actually did not, and has still, as of today, have not attacked any US ships in the Red Sea. So with all of this in mind, how would you put this behavior in the broader context of the Houthi behavior since the start of the Red Sea crisis?
Thank you, Sherwan, for the very good question, and thank you, Vina, for the brilliant overview. I'll try to share my screen with the presentation of my report. Please let me know if you can see it. Is it there, Sherwan?
Yes.
Thank you, brilliant. So just to answer your question, I guess we need to move a step back and try to understand what was the situation with the Houthi attacks right before the 12-day war that Israel waged on Iran. So following the 6 May ceasefire between the United States and the Houthis had completely halted their attacks on US warships. In addition, attacks on commercial shipping had completely ceased, at least by December 2024. So the only form of military operations in support of Gaza that the Houthis had continued were the attacks against Israel on Israeli territory. Before the 12-day war, we used to record an average of 4 attacks per week. But with the 12-day war, as you just recalled, Sherwan, there was just one Houthi attack against Israel. Now, this is not surprising. This is not a new pattern. This is rather a historical pattern that we have already observed. Back in April 2024, when Iran carried out its first attack against Israel, the Houthis completely ceased all their attacks for around 9 days. And what does it mean? It means that in these specific circumstances, the Houthis are trying to avoid escalating regional tensions, right? And the Gaza war becomes subordinated to the broader strategic interests of the axis of resistance. And now on the second point that you just mentioned, it's right. On the eve of the US attack on Iranian nuclear facilities, the Houthis vowed to resume attacks on US warships. And although they have the capabilities to launch long-range drone and missile attacks, even against US warships, they did not follow through on their actions. And I guess that the answer to the question of why they didn't will emerge from the presentation of my newest report. Now, the report is called Red Sea Hall of Mirrors. Why? Because a hall of mirrors is a situation where reality is distorted and it's difficult to distinguish between truth and illusion. And what I argue is that public statements during the Red Sea crisis obscured strategic considerations and the pragmatic interests of the actors involved in the crisis. So with this report, I'm trying to contrast rhetoric and facts to reveal the concealed agenda of the actors involved in the Red Sea crisis, and mainly the US and the Houthis. Now, I will anticipate three main takeaways of this report. The first one is that US air attacks in Yemen have not fully degraded the Houthis' long-range drone and missile arsenal. The second takeaway is that a few well-placed Houthi golden shots or high-impact strikes are very likely to reignite a global shipping crisis. And the third takeaway is that the real strength of the Houthis is not really the volume of their arsenal, but rather their ability to sustain a heightened perception of risk in the Red Sea and in the region. And now I will try to present a few examples from the report to bring evidence to these takeaways. So I will start basically, let me just find a laser pointer, yes. I will start with some Houthi statements and Houthi rhetoric and try to assess the gap between action and rhetoric. Now, a core feature of Houthi Red Sea narratives during the Red Sea crisis was the phased escalation. So the Houthis, since October 2023, portrayed their military actions in support of Palestine as increasingly gradual. This means that each phase expanded both the target bank and the geographical reach of the Houthi attacks. Between November 2023 and July 2024, the Houthis have announced 5 different phases of escalation. And the question here is if these rhetorical escalations are matched by concrete operational shifts. By looking at the data, it's pretty clear that phases 1 to 3 of Houthi attacks that more or less ranged between November 2023 and July 2024, and April 2024, reflected a widening of target types, an increase in the number of attacks, and an expansion of the geographic reach of the attacks. So phases 1 to 3 were effectively escalatory phases. However, phase 4 and 5 did not translate into escalatory action and mainly functioned as symbolic announcements. In phase 4, the Houthis declared an expansion of their attacks to the Mediterranean, and we do not have even a single attack corroborated in the Mediterranean. And in phase 5, the Houthis signaled a shift towards attacking Israel, but at the same time, they also de-escalated in the Red Sea. So, the takeaway here is that Houthi rhetoric leverages uncertainty about their actual capabilities to signal ongoing escalation and cultivate deterrence, even in the absence of concrete action. Now, very often the Red Sea crisis is portrayed as one crisis, but it consists of 3 separate fronts. One of these fronts is, of course, the Houthi attacks on Israel, at least from their perspective. Now, Houthi attacks on Israel started on the 19th of October following the Al-Ahli hospital massacre, and the Houthis clarified what their goals are in attacking Israel. Initially, they claimed that their attacks were deterrent action vis-à-vis Tel Aviv. Subsequently, they claimed that the early attacks disrupted activity at targeted bases and airports inside Israel. And lastly, they claimed that they created a state of terror, fear, and anxiety in Israel. Now, we want to test these claims by comparing how different attack patterns impacted on the number of flights in Ben Gurion Airport in Israel. Now, in this visual here, you can see that in the upper part, we have the number of Houthi attacks targeting Israel. And in the lower part, instead, we have the percentage decrease in the number of flights at Ben Gurion compared to the baseline of pre-COVID number of flights in 2019. So based on this analysis, we can discern between two phases of Houthi attacks against Israel. In the first moment of their attacks between October 2023 and July 2024, Houthi strikes were mainly symbolic. Okay, they were considered as a sort of show of solidarity with Gaza and a sign of escalatory posture, but the damage caused to Israel was really minor. The Houthis nonetheless claimed success due to the huge drop in the number of flights in Israel. But it's pretty clear that this drop in the number of flights was caused by the general security fallout ensuing from the Hamas-Israel war rather than by the Houthi attacks that remain more or less constant despite the fact that the number of flights continued to increase throughout the months. The second phase of attacks against Israel instead started in July 2024 and it continues to the present. And it was effectively an escalatory phase. The Houthis improved the range of their weapons, they increased the frequency of attacks, they very clearly targeted military bases and Ben Gurion airport with the idea of imposing an embargo on the airport. And as we can see, this led to a great spike in the number of Houthi attacks, especially in December 2024. Nonetheless, despite the spike, the number of flights in Ben Gurion has continued to increase. The only exception was the golden shot that the Houthis launched in early May 2025 on Ben Gurion that successfully reached the target and caused a major drop in the number of flights in Ben Gurion. So what are the takeaways from this visual? Firstly, that an escalation in the frequency of attacks does not necessarily increase risk perception if those attacks are unsuccessful. And the second point is that golden shots, Houthi golden shots, can have a disproportionately large effect and trigger a prolonged crisis dynamic that may persist for months. Now, moving to the second front of the Red Sea crisis, we are going to look at Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. Starting from November with the hijacking of the Galaxy Leader, the Houthis targeted commercial vessels in the Red Sea along with warships. They clearly claimed that their attacks were acts of solidarity with Gaza and direct responses to Israeli military operations. And they also claimed that their attacks somehow were aimed to compel Israel to resume aid delivery in Gaza, to end the siege on Gaza and bring a halt to military operations in Gaza. Now, of course, here we can ask, are Red Sea attacks a direct response to developments in Gaza? And the first answer is that, of course, there are a few positive correlations. The Houthis halted all attacks following the 19 January 25 Israel-Hamas ceasefire. And it's plausible that in the future, they will again temporarily halt all attacks in case of ceasefire. However, irrespective of the situation in Gaza, the Houthis have leveraged these attacks to advance their own domestic and regional agendas. And despite their public rhetoric, they have shown little willingness to pursue operations that would harm their strategic interests. Now, to prove this point, I have prepared this visual here, where you can see the number of Houthi attacks on commercial ships. Now, we could use a number of different examples, but I think that this one is especially clear. Here, in the last week of May, you see the peak in the number of Houthi attacks throughout the whole crisis, right? It was the highest weekly number of Houthi attacks, and it was followed by the highest monthly number of Houthi attacks against commercial shipping. Now, this escalation was not triggered at all by the situation in Gaza, but rather it was a reaction to measures implemented by the Yemeni internationally recognized government. Why? Because at the end of May, the IRG, the internationally recognized government, introduced measures to assert control over the financial sector in Yemen and weaken the Houthis' economic power. More or less at the same time, the US stepped up the pace of their operations in Yemen and shifted their airstrikes to targeting Houthi critical infrastructure. And so we can understand this spike in the number of attacks as a reaction to these domestic developments. What's even more critical is the fact that, as you can see, following the agreement between the Houthis and the IRG called the Economic De-Escalation Agreement, there was a drop in the number of Houthi attacks. And even more interestingly, After this accord, the Houthis gradually shifted their attacks from the Red Sea and commercial shipping to targeting US warships and Israel. And they never publicly acknowledged this shift. Now, I will argue that this shift likely reflects multiple strategic calculations on behalf of the Houthis. Firstly, after several rounds of US airstrikes, they needed to replenish the stockpile. Secondly, they wanted to implement a marginal gains strategy. The Houthis are very well aware of the fact that using largely symbolic strikes can amplify risk perception, and so a limited number of attacks can yield significant psychological and strategic effects without depleting resources, so they don't need to launch many attacks. Just a few are sufficient to maintain the same level of high-risk perception. And lastly, specifically in that period, the Houthis tried to decouple the Red Sea crisis from the Gaza crisis. And by easing pressure on maritime trade, they thought that they could reduce international backlash while continuing to support the Palestinian cause by launching attacks against Israel and US warships. Now, let's move to another topic that perhaps is less known to the public. The Houthis also developed their own narrative on the crisis and on trade. More specifically, they argued that the global shipping crisis was not triggered by their actions and that their actions were not a threat to global shipping lanes. They claimed that they only targeted Israeli-linked or bound vessels, as well as UK and US interests, and they accused the US of fabricating the crisis by militarizing the Red Sea. Now, so the first question is, are the Houthis only targeting US, UK, and Israeli ships? Now, here, it's difficult to provide a certain answer, but based on the public data we recorded, it seems that that only 17% of the commercial ships targeted by the Houthis were affiliated with Israel, the US, or the UK. The most frequently targeted vessels were Greek vessels, actually. But the point here is that the Houthis applied very broad criteria to select the commercial ships to be targeted. And these very broad criteria reinforced the perception that commercial shipping was being targeted indiscriminately, so contradicting Houthi claims that all commercial ships are safe. Now, let's have a look at the other Houthi claim. So, is the crisis in the Red Sea fabricated by the US and by the financial system, by the Western financial system? Now, to answer this question, we will have a look at this visual. As you can see in the upper part of the visual, we have a representation of the weekly number of transits through Bab al-Mandab and through the Cape of Good Hope. In the lower part instead, we have the number of Houthi attacks, the weekly number of Houthi attacks. As you can see, in the early part of the crisis, Houthi attacks did not trigger a drop in the number of transits through Bab al-Mandab. Actually, the drop occurred only after that Lloyd's Joint War Committee expanded the high-risk area in the Red Sea. This caused an increase in war risk premiums, and this led the ships to reroute through the Cape of Good Hope. Regarding this point, this is why the Houthis claim that it was basically the Western financial system to create the crisis. But of course, it's also true that it was the Houthi attacks that led the Joint War Committee to reassess the high-risk area. Now, another interesting point here is that the number of transits remained more or less stable throughout the whole crisis, despite the variations in the number of Houthi attacks. So there was no reaction to the increase in the number of Houthi attacks, and there was no reaction when the Houthis completely halted their attacks between the 19th of January and the 16th of March. The explanation here is that insurance premiums take 2 to 3 months to normalize. After that, the situation will go back to normal. And so the continuation of Houthi attacks in the Red Sea is enough to maintain a prolonged state of crisis. And of course, the vessels used alternative routes throughout the whole crisis. Now, let me address a last point about the US airstrike campaigns. The US launched two main operations in Yemen starting from January 2024. The first operation was called Poseidon Archer, and it was under the Biden administration. The second operation, it was launched on the 15th of March in 2025 by the Trump administration. It's interesting to note that both operations had a similar public goal, and the goal was to degrade Houthi military capabilities to conduct attacks on US and international vessels. Both presidents referred to Iran as a regional threat and as a sponsor of Houthi attacks. But they somehow posed a different emphasis on how to react to the Houthi threat. More specifically, the Trump administration outlined a number of secondary goals. They clarified that they wanted to target the Houthi leadership with a decapitation strategy. They clarified that they aimed to fully neutralize the Houthi long-range drone and missile capabilities. And somehow they, not publicly, but they made it clear that it was okay for them if the internationally recognized government somehow benefited from the strikes that they carried out against the Houthis. Now, with this visual here, you can see the number of US airstrikes in Yemen. In red, you have airstrikes on critical infrastructure, whereas in green, you have preemptive airstrikes or dynamic targeting. As you can clearly see, phase one of Operation Poseidon Archer, despite the public goal of degrading Houthi capabilities, was mainly a defensive operation. The vast majority of the strikes were preemptive strikes on missiles and drones on the launch rate. So this was a limited US intervention, and it helped keeping a door open for diplomacy. Now, despite the limited scope of this intervention, Trump harshly criticized Biden's campaign in Yemen. But nonetheless, he adopted a more aggressive approach. If we move to Operation Rough Rider, we can see that in just 51 days, the US carried out 461 airstrike events, a 47% increase compared to Operation Poseidon Archer. And also the events were extremely lethal, with an estimated 515 fatalities caused by the airstrikes. So let's ask a question. Was this a defeat for Trump, or rather for the Houthis? Now, of course, the 6 May US-Houthi ceasefire led to a halt in Houthi attacks on US ships, but this is basically rewinding the tape, right? Because the situation before the US airstrikes was the same. The Houthis were not attacking US warships before the Operation Rough Rider campaign started. Second point, despite the at least 30 airstrike events targeting Houthi leaders, these only led to kill mid-ranking officers. So the goal of decapitating the Houthi leadership with symbolic strikes on the main leaders of the Houthis was not achieved. And third, clearly the campaign did not fully degrade Houthi long-range drone and missile capabilities. I mean, their capabilities were degraded, but as the attacks on Israel are clearly demonstrating, the Houthis still possess long-range capabilities. And lastly, it had a negative effect because it sent an ambiguous message to the IRG by targeting Houthi objectives on the front lines. Now, I think I have already talked too much, so I will probably leave the floor to Sherwan, and thank you.
Thank you, Luca. That was a great presentation. Thank you very much. And next, we will give the floor again to Dina to talk us through a bit about the Gulf states and their position right now in this larger regional escalation involving the Houthis.
Yeah, and also thank you, Luca, for the extremely informative presentation. When it comes to the Gulf countries, in the recent conflict, and even since October the 7th, they have tried their very best to contain the Israel, Iran, and also Iran and US rifts and maintain dialogue with Iran throughout the conflict's entirety. Although, the latest Al Udeid attack was really a wake-up call for the GCC, and it was disastrous for them, even though it was pre-communicated to them beforehand. In their eyes, since 2019, US security umbrella had once again failed them. And I think, there's an acknowledgement that Qatar would take the brunt of the attacks, but for Iran, it makes sense. Attacking Doha was its safest option to do, as it has one of the best relationships with Doha. And there was obviously some kind of agreement made between Doha and Iran beforehand that, Qatar would withstand these shocks. But that still doesn't change the risk perception from the GCC, which is now extremely threatened. Israel has, I would say, carved out the new rules of the game for the region by directly hitting Iran. And no matter if Gulf states like it or not, if the ceasefire breaks down, they are highly likely to get caught in the crossfire again. Shortly after the Al Udeid attack, we saw the GCC condemn it immediately. And this kind of unity, it's not exactly normal for the GCC. There was a sense that they really absorbed that risk together. It was a real moment of terror for the Gulf, and it was felt by all of the Gulf countries. You could literally see the drones from the majority of the GCC states. And it doesn't go with the image that the GCC is trying to strive for, of, turning their economy into major tourist hubs. For example, Saudi Arabia has been on their path for economic transformation, which has been an utmost priority for them since 2015, opening up the economy, encouraging foreign investment in the country, bringing women into the workforce, and also opening new sectors like tourism. And these ambitions are directly hurt when there's ballistic missiles that are falling from the sky and in a region of volatility. I think, as Luca has explained, there's less of an interest by the Houthis to escalate with the Gulf right now, despite threats on, hitting Gulf countries. There's a real low interest to actually execute that for now. I would say that there has been some rhetoric during the Israel-Iran war, much like Iranian media rhetoric, that to criticize Gulf countries for hosting US bases. But prior to the US and Houthi ceasefire, the UAE was lobbying for a targeted operation in Hodeidah to offseat the Houthis from the West Coast. And this offensive, the UAE didn't get to execute back in 2018 due to pressure from the US, from the UK, and the UN. And it seemed like right before the US and Houthi ceasefire pact, it seemed like there was international appetite for potentially an offensive there again. But it turned out that the US was extremely non-committal and Saudi did not give the green light. I think Saudi Arabia has tried to separate themselves from the Red Sea conflict for as long as possible. They're looking out for themselves. They don't want to lose what they've invested in speaking to the Houthis, which their dialogue, which started in 2022. So far, the Saudis have proven actually quite successful in isolating themselves from the Red Sea attacks and the broader regional conflagration. But whether or not there's a war in Hodeidah, I think it's important to note that as Luca highlighted, that the Red Sea conflict still remains, and the Red Sea in itself, it's slowly emerging as a hotspot of great power and regional competition. If there is a new offensive in Hodeidah, it will not just stay in Yemen. It would have increasingly global consequences, and it could draw various actors from, for example, Africa. The UAE, for example, back the rapid support forces in Sudan, while Iran, Russia support the Sudanese armed forces. And of course, Iranian support for the Houthis and Russian connection to the Houthis as well put them on very much opposing sides of the conflict on both shores of the Red Sea. There's also UAE military bases in Somalia, and that could be used to launch such a campaign, which risks also drawing in al-Shabaab, which are reportedly developing ties with the Houthis via arms smuggling and also shared enemies in general. So what we're basically seeing emerging in the Red Sea is an environment where actors are, very much cooperating in one area while competing militarily in another, or even in the same theater, and regardless of their ideological alignment. And the Houthis, for their part, they're opportunists by nature and have built relationships that cross, both geographic locations and ideological boundaries. And, these will likely benefit them in future conflicts. I will now give the floor back to Sherwan.
Thank you, Bina, and thank you both actually for your presentations and critical insights. It definitely sounds like we're on the threshold of a new kind of dynamics in the region, especially in the Red Sea. And after both of your wonderful presentation, now it's time to open the floor for questions. So I'll get us started off with a question from ACLA's own head of analysis, Andrea Carboni. How are Saudi Arabia and the UAE reacting to this regional turmoil? And what role can they play in elevating tensions in the Red Sea and the region at large? And it'd be great also if you can talk, if either of you can talk about this and maybe say something about what new options, what new avenues these countries can follow now that it seems that the Gulf is more entangled in this potential violence due to the regional escalation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, since October the 7th, as I mentioned, Saudi has really trying to capitalize on this role as a mediator, and it has ensured that it's kept communication channels open with Iran, and these channels are only getting stronger. I think straight after, as soon as Israel started striking Iran, Saudi was very quick to condemn those attacks, and Iran took note of that and praised Saudi. But I think behind closed doors, I think Gulf countries really acknowledge that nobody can tell Trump what to do, and no one really has leverage over Israel as well. All they can do is really isolate themselves from the broader conflict, ensure that it doesn't spill over. But I think there's a growing kind of sentiment that, the US is very temperamental, and both countries do not have Gulf countries' best interests in heart. And in light of that, you see real GCC unity in trying to, work together and ensure that they are isolated from any broader conflict. I think there's a lot of coordination within each other. I think, as I said, the GCC really felt this pain together, and now they are afraid if the Israel-Iran ceasefire breaks down that they will get caught in the crossfire, and as a result, they're only, really capitalizing on that communication channel with Iran. In terms of what roles they can play in the Red Sea, I think, Saudi, since these attacks started, they try to have different kind of regional forums, including Egypt and Jordan, different kind of conferences taking place. But what is actually needed is a sustained and continuous, like GCC-wide effort for potentially a maritime security council or a framework to kind of coordinate coast guards, share intelligence and de-escalate tensions. I think the sporadic actions that are taken at the moment isn't enough, and the Houthis are kind of, they're winning over the disorganized approach by the GCC countries. But I think if there is more of a unified effort from the different GCC countries to actually invest money and military into the situation, something could happen.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that answer. And now, of course, we cannot mention Saudi Arabia and the GCC without mentioning the other side of the Gulf, which is Iran, who is now in a very, as we mentioned before, is a very precarious situation in comparison to before October 7th, with its proxies in disarray across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. Now, based on, and this question is for me, I suppose, and it's for you, Bina, based on what we know Iran is trying to do right now by pivoting a bit away from the axis of resistance proxies and trying to find a new balance for it in the region. How do you think this will affect this relationship with the Houthis specifically in the coming period? I mean, I'm sure they're not gonna, there's still gonna be a lot of, I'm sorry to keep adding to this. I'm sure there's gonna be still a good relations maintained. But in terms of maybe more material support or more diplomatic support, will there be more of that, less of that in the period, you think?
I think, yeah, there has been definitely a lot of conversations within the Islamic Republic itself on how to kind of deal with the axis of resistance after the severe blows that they endured. And I think there was kind of a growing consensus, not just by Iran, but the different actors themselves, like Hezbollah and the Iraqi groups, that right now, what is best is really to focus on that domestic survival, right? Like focusing on their domestic landscapes and ensuring that, they're not fighting just on behalf of Iran and going to bear the brunt. I think it's important to remember that, when Israel went into Lebanon last year, Iran didn't do anything. And it was negotiating with the US when the US was hitting Yemen. And I think the different actors took note of that, and it really justified them not doing anything when Israel started bombarding Iran. And Iran is okay with that. I think right now, the Islamic Republic is very much prioritizing their own survival. And I think the conversations, especially in the reformist camp, is really focusing on, okay, how to kind of pivot the acts of resistance to be less of a non-state actor relationship, which will make them more vulnerable to these kind of American and Israeli attacks, and shift it more into the kind of economic and state-to-state partnership that they would want. Right. And that is, in a way, kind of deprioritizing the acts of resistance as their main line of defense and focusing more on, Iranian ballistic missile and also their nuclear policy as well, and reducing the importance of these actors. So that's all to say that, Iran really sees value in the Houthis. I don't think that's going to go away. I think there's an operation room. I think all attacks are very much coordinated. But in terms of when to use them, I think that's going to change because Iran knows the calculus of Israel and the US if these actors are to show more of a force in future conflicts.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you for that answer. Now, for the next question, this one is for you, Luca. Can you say more about how Operation Rough Rider sent mixed messages to the IRG?
Yes, of course. I mean, again, we need to take a step back to understand how that operation launched mixed messages. Vina partly already tackled this issue. Following the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, many IRG officers thought that there was political momentum to build consensus around the idea of a military advance pushing back the Houthis in Yemen. There were several different plans. And as far as I understand, also the transitional team of President Trump was discussing a potential scenario in which a military advance could be supported by the United States in late 2024. They were discussing this issue. So following the fall of Assad, several IRG officers thought that with the new administration, perhaps the US could support indirectly through the UAE a military advance on the West Coast with the aim of retaking Hodeidah and perhaps triggering the fall of the Houthi regime from the inside with popular uprisings in Sana'a. This idea was somehow strengthened when the US airstrikes started because during the first weeks of Operation Rough Rider, some front lines were targeted. And after a brief pause of a couple of weeks, again, the front lines were targeted in Adaleh, in Marib, in Tahita, in Hodeidah. And somehow this sent a mixed message to the IRG because it seemed like Trump could even discuss a potential support from Saudi Arabia for a military intervention in Yemen during his visit in Riyadh, which of course then went in a different direction.
Okay, thank you for that. And we next have a question from an anonymous attendee. Is there any indication that the Houthis in Israel could escalate imminently? And I can actually answer just a bit about that based on all our own accolade data. And the fact is, on June 28th, the Houthis again started claiming attacks against Israel. And they actually also retroactively claimed attacks from the week prior that they didn't claim at the time, which is not usual behavior by them. So what we're seeing is a return to the pre-Iran-Israel exchange of missiles kind of scenario, where the Houthis will send a few missiles every week, usually 3 to 4, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more. Almost all of them are intercepted by the IDF, or they just fail to reach their target and they crash somewhere, likely in the Red Sea, before they reach Israeli airspace. And in return, Israel will also strike Houthi targets very irregularly to kind of send a message also that we know you're striking us and we will respond when we need to. So far, this pattern hasn't shown an escalation yet. Although last month, the Israeli Navy, for the first time, hit Yemen, Houthi targets in Yemen, which is a first. And an Israeli airstrike the Israelis tried to assassinate the Houthi chief of staff in Sana'a, which was not a successful assassination attempt, although then he was injured according to reports. So there is a bit of like an escalation in, I guess, quality rather than quantity there, with the Israelis trying to be more selective in their targeting and to strike the Houthis harder. How long will this last? No one knows really. Like Lucas said, the Houthis also, rely on a golden shot opportunities every once in a while. When those happen, they do change the dynamics a bit. And when will this happen? If this will happen, that remains to be seen, and will probably also be affected by the regional developments happening across the Middle East. Great. So for the next question, we have a question for you, Vina. Could you talk with us a bit more about the linkages between the Houthis and Al-Shabaab, and how much evidence is there for this cooperation?
Yeah, sure. I also want to caveat that I'm not an Al-Shabaab expert, but I think it's very careful, especially when looking at the movement, not to overplay these links and not to underplay these links. I think they're very much still in fruition, and I think the Houthis are testing different kind of alliances. I think, the Houthis looked at what happened in Lebanon and how no one really came to save Hezbollah or coordinate with Hezbollah. And I think the Houthis in this sense are very eager to diversify their relationships and take advantage of the different actors that lie in Africa. And I think, as I was saying before, despite ideological differences, there is evidence and also, common sense that the Houthis would try to establish ties with, the Islamic State of Somalia and Al-Shabaab. And I think at this point, this is more in terms of like transfer of weapons to other state actors as well. I think what the Houthis really want to capitalize on is a supply chain connecting Yemen and the Horn of Africa, particularly in Djibouti and also in Somalia. And what that could mean in practice is, supplying ISS with short-range aerial drones and maybe technical training as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I think we have time for one more question. And for this one, it's a very good question. That takes us back to Yemen as the center stage of the Red Sea crisis too. And this question is for Luca. What opportunities in this context for national Yemeni peace processes, if any? Or do you see mostly risks for potential settlement at the national level in Yemen at this time?
Well, if we look at the peace process historically, it was December 2023 when the United Nations, the Office of the Special Envoy, announced the UN Peace Roadmap. It was not like 10 years ago. It was just 1 year and a half ago, although it seems ages. Now, Saudi Arabia has proved that they are willing to exit the Yemen war and they want to appear as mediators, and they have continued dialogue with the Houthis, with their back channels throughout the whole crisis. What is really hampering currently the communication between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia is the designation of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. Following the FTO designation, it would be extremely challenging to implement the UN Peace Roadmap as it was designed by the UN. And so it will be necessary perhaps to start new negotiations on a new peace plan. Another major obstacle to the peace process in Yemen is, of course, the weakness of the IRG field. And it seems that there is agreement around the fact that a reform of the Presidential Leadership Council would be a necessary step in order to strengthen the IRG field and allow for meaningful negotiations with the Houthis. So I hope that in the coming months we will see progress in both these domains, and this will lead to new prospects for peace.
Great. Well, we still have 3 minutes left, but I think should give us enough time to answer one more question. And this is an interesting one. And let's assume there's a breakdown in the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, and there's a resume escalation. What is the likelihood of a Houthi role in a potential blocking of the Strait of Hormuz?
I can say my views, and then Luca, feel free to interject. So I don't think it's in their interest to play around the Strait of Hormuz, and there's no need for them to. I think Iran is geographically well positioned to do what they can in the Strait of Hormuz. They can close it. The Houthis aren't really needed. But if we do get to a situation, which I do think is unlikely, but if there is a situation where there's a breakdown on ceasefire, Iran sees this is the only card they have. Well, I can imagine if the Houthis see that Iran is really in an existential position, they can escalate their attacks in the Red Sea, for example. But I think the Houthis very much see these as different theaters, and they're not part of the Strait of Hormuz theater, and there'll be no need to interfere there, and they can't play a big role there if they wanted to anyway.
I think I will speak more to the technical capabilities of the Houthis in doing that. I mean, if you remember, back in March 2024, the Houthis actually announced an expansion of their operations to the Indian Ocean. And although they have claimed several attacks in the Indian Ocean, there are just a few attacks corroborated in those areas. And the rate of success of those attacks is extremely low, because clearly the farther the attacks go, the lower is the rate of success of Houthi attacks. So actually, I don't know how effective the Houthis could be in supporting with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but they already threatened to basically ban the transit of Israeli ships through the Cape of Good Hope and through the Indian Ocean.
Yes. Okay, thank you for these answers. So I think we're at the end of the webinar. Thank you both for wonderful presentations and for joining us today, Luca and Vina. And thanks to all of our attendees. And sorry we didn't have time to answer all of your questions. Hopefully there'll be more opportunities in the future. And again, thank you all, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day or evening.